All right, hello everybody. Welcome to another Bible study here on the Evidence for God website and YouTube channel. Please take a moment to subscribe to the YouTube channel and check out our website. It's evidence4god.org, evidence4god.org. Please subscribe. And we're trying a new format out with these slides and just audio. So give us a comment. Let us know how you like it. All right, let's get into the lesson. Today's study is Keys to Old Testament Prophecy. So, what about the Old Testament prophecies of Israel's restoration? Let me be right up front with you guys and let you know where I stand on this. I believe in what is called replacement theology. Now, I know this is not popular today. The majority in the Christian world believe in basically what is taught in the Left Behind series of videos and books. And that is the idea that the Old Testament prophecies referring to Israel's restoration are referring to the literal nation of Israel being restored in the Middle East to some level of greatness. And there's variations on it, but most people say something to the effect of that the Jewish nation will be converted and be restored to greatness, and then the second coming will happen. That's the basic picture. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't believe that's biblical. Doesn't mean you're a bad person if you believe that, and I certainly am not anti-Jewish people. I'm not anti the Jewish nation even. I think Israel is doing a lot of great things in the Middle East. But I don't believe that that's a biblical view. And so you don't have to be anti-Jewish or anti-Israel to say, I don't think that's biblical. In fact, I would suggest to you that if you read history, you will see that this view, which is dominant today, was not the majority view in the Christian church for the majority of Christian history. It actually wasn't even popular until barely like a couple hundred years ago, when things like dispensationalism became popular. Before then, most, at least Protestant Bible scholars, Martin Luther, these kind of guys, Wesley and Calvin, most Bible scholars believed in what is called replacement theology. And this is the idea, very simply, that the church today, anyone who believes in Jesus, doesn't matter what your background is, you can be black, white, purple, doesn't matter. If you accept Christ, you are a spiritual Jew, and spiritual Jews are all that matters. There is no nation of Israel that has a place in prophecy today, physical Israel. That's just all the Old Testament prophecies after the destruction of the nation of Israel back in the time of the apostles. Everything now applies, all the prophecies now apply to the church. And so whenever Israel is spoken of in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, after that time, it's referring to Christians. It's a symbol for Christians. Now, most Christians would agree with that concept to some degree because the New Testament is abundantly clear on that. Paul says it, if you are Christ, then you're Abraham's seed, etc. And by the way, I have a whole study on this, who is the real Israel. So please check that out if you're not clear on this. But just because you agree that the church is spiritual Israel, some will still say, yeah, but those Old Testament prophecies, that's referring to physical Israel. It sounds really literal. It sounds like it's referring to the literal Jews. And there's many problems with that. So it's very crucial to understand this. And just up front, to tell you one of the biggest problems with it is, if you think literal Israel is the subject of the end time prophecies, then you are going to conclude that the enemies of Israel are also literal. So you would be talking about literal Babylon, literal Moab, instead of some spiritual Babylon. And so it comes to the idea that you're going to be confused who the enemies of God's people are in the last days. And I think this is the tactic of the devil to get your eyes off of the real Babylon onto some political nation that's going on to the world and distract the church. Okay. Now, before we get into all this, and how to understand these Old Testament prophecies that relate to Israel, I want to give you an example. And it's going to be something that is going to be confusing, and it's going to seem like a contradiction at first, but it's not. And the reason I do this is to just get your mind thinking. And then we're going to answer this contradiction at the end, okay? So our example is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 24. And this is often referred to as the Master's prophecy, Jesus's prophecy, Matthew 24. And we're going to look at some verses that look like they are contradicting each other, but they are not. The Bible never contradicts itself. Okay, starting in verse 27. And we don't have to read the whole thing, but it's 27 through 31. For as lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. What does that sound like? That sounds like the second coming, right? And then talks about the signs that will appear in the heavens. Verse 30, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then shall all tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Then it talks about him collecting his people from the four corners of the earth. It's clearly speaking of the second coming. Now, a few verses later, it's all one continual passage. In verse 34, he says this, Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Now you may say right away, wait a minute. If verse 27 through 31 is talking about the second coming, then verse 34 says all these things are going to be fulfilled during this current generation, then it seems like we got a contradiction because the second coming didn't happen back in the first century. Now, it's important that you understand these kind of things because when I was a baby Christian, somebody approached me with that, and it challenged my faith. It kind of unsettled me, and it made me question my faith for a little bit because they were basically saying, look, Jesus was a false prophet. He predicted that his second coming was going to happen soon, and it didn't happen. Therefore, how do you accept the Bible? And so you've got to know how to answer these things, or else your faith could get shaken just like mine did. So now, it's not a contradiction. It just seems like it on the surface. We will answer this apparent contradiction, and we'll clarify it at the end of the lesson. I just want to get you to see how some things could on the surface appear to be a contradiction if you take them overly, well, we'll explain at the end. Okay. Many Old Testament prophecies about Israel are confusing. Let me just throw that out there. There's a lot of people who read these Old Testament prophecies and say, I don't get it. This is confusing. Especially if you're saying, well, how could this be talking about something literal? And then you come to a bunch of problems. So how do we solve these problems? Well, there's a few keys that I have for you guys that I think are biblical. And the key for anything is always to let the Bible explain itself whenever you're dealing with prophecy. So here are our 3 keys. Number 1, mixing of events. So that's 2 events that happen at separate times, but they're mixed together in the same passage. Mixing events. Okay. Number 2, our second key to understanding Old Testament prophecy. Literal people and places, but that are used symbolically. So a literal name of a place or a person is used, but it's not talking about that literal place or person. It's a symbol. I'm going to give you examples of this to prove this is a biblical concept. Again, we want to let the Bible translate itself. And then our last key is definite prophecies. Okay, and that one will be simple, and we'll get to that. All right, so how do you know the difference between a literal and a symbolic prophecy? The answer is forced parables. God forces you to realize that something is symbolic. He forces you to realize that it's a parable. That's the conclusion. And we'll get to that when we get to the conclusion, what forced parables are. Now, let me give you the examples of those 3 keys. The first one, mixing of events. So our example is the day of the Lord. Now, when you hear that term, the day of the Lord, most people immediately think, and correctly so, that the day of the Lord refers to the second coming. However, if you study this subject, you will find that the term, yes, refers to the second coming, but it also refers to other things. So in Joel chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, and we're not going to read that whole thing again for the sake of time. Please read it on your own. But you'll see it speaks of the destruction of literal Israel in the days of Joel, something that's going to happen immediately in his time. And in chapter 1, verse 15 through 20. Chapter 2, he continues the same idea of some destruction that's coming from the enemies of Israel to attack God's people, Israel, in those days. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Again, we're not going to read that whole thing. Please read it. You'll see it's talking about these armies coming upon Israel. They're compared to as locusts, and they're going to cause all this destruction in the nation of Israel. And he calls it the day of the Lord. In chapters 1 and chapter 2, he calls it the day of the Lord. But then in chapter 3, using the same term, the day of the Lord, he now starts speaking of the second coming. Now let's read some of these verses and it'll be clear this is talking about the end of time. And most Bible scholars, if you quote these verses, chapter 3, verse 14 through 16, they will agree this is speaking about the second coming. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. That's verse 14. 15. The sun and the moon shall be darkened, the stars shall withdraw their shining. That's something that's also referred to in the book of Revelation and in Matthew 24 as something that happens just before the second coming. The sun and the moon are darkened, the stars shall withdraw their shining. Verse 16. The Lord shall also roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake, but the Lord will be a hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So this passage, most Bible scholars would say, yeah, this refers to the second coming, but it's referring to it as the day of the Lord, and the context is the destruction of God's people by Gentile armies coming to attack them. So chapter 1, day of the Lord, but this is something that happened in Joel's day. Chapter 2, day of the Lord, destruction of Israel, but it's something that happened in Joel's day. Chapter 3, day of the Lord, but now it's referring to the second coming. So why mix those two events together? You see the idea? Two events, the destruction of Israel by God's enemies in Joel's day, and then boom, right next to it, the second coming. Why mix those two events? The reason why is because the events are similar in some way. Not that they're happening one right after another or at the same time, but they are similar. And this is done over and over in the Old Testament. I could give multiple examples of this. If you want to know more on this, look up the term telescoping in prophecy. It's often referred to as telescoping, where a prophet will refer to two things, two events that happen very distant times from each other, but the prophet puts the two events right next to each other. Okay, so that's one example of mixing of events. The next key is literal people and places used symbolically. Literal people and places, but they aren't meant to be taken literally. So let me give you the example. In Matthew 2, verse 18. Matthew 2, verse 18. Now, you read this, you read the context, you could start the whole chapter, but starting really in verse 16, it talks about Herod sending soldiers to go kill all the children that are under the age of, 2? 2 years old in Bethlehem because he was trying to kill Jesus. Verse 17 says, then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, verse 18, in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not. Now, who is Rachel? That's an Old Testament matriarch, one of the wives of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, Jacob's wife, right? And is this speaking of Rachel literally, though? Did Rachel live in the days of Jesus? Was she crying for these children? No. This isn't, she didn't even live in the days of Jeremiah when he predicted this. So what you see is that when you read this passage in Jeremiah, it's talking about a mother weeping for her children, and she wouldn't be comforted because her children are gone. And Jeremiah, he uses the term Rachel to speak symbolically of women and of all these mothers weeping for their children in Bethlehem. But it doesn't tell you that in Jeremiah. The Bible doesn't say, hey, this is a symbol. It just says Rachel. And then in the New Testament, it interprets it and says, here's the fulfilling, but it's not literal. It's not literally Rachel. Do you see what I'm talking about? Now, there's multiple examples of this. I'll give you another one. When the Old Testament says that before the coming of Christ, God will send Elijah the prophet. In the New Testament tells us that this was fulfilled when John the Baptist came before the first coming of Christ. But John the Baptist was not literally Elijah. Now, how do you reconcile this? The Old Testament, it doesn't say, I'm going to send you somebody who symbolically is Elijah. It doesn't say that. It just says, I'll send Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. That wasn't literally Elijah. In fact, they asked John the Baptist, are you Elijah? And he said no, he was not literally Elijah. But then when they asked Jesus, Jesus said, Elijah did come, but they didn't recognize him. And then he tells them, if you can accept it, this is Elijah. John is Elijah who was to come. So he is Elijah, but he isn't Elijah. What does that mean? It means he's symbolically Elijah. This is explained when John the Baptist's father received a vision before he was born, and it says, your wife's going to have a child. He will come in the spirit and power of Elijah. So spiritually, he was like Elijah. He was a great prophet, but he wasn't literally Elijah. Now, again, the Old Testament does not tell you, hey, this is a symbol. You've got to figure it out. How will you figure it out? Well, number one, Elijah went to heaven. So if another man's going to be born, the Bible doesn't do reincarnation. That's not Elijah. That's a different man. And so if that's the prophet, then it must be someone who came in the spirit of Elijah, like the New Testament says. But again, the point is, there are times when people and places are used symbolically in prophecy, and they are not meant to be taken literally. Now, you can disagree with me on the whole Israel thing and Israel and end time prophecy, but you got to accept the fact that it is a possibility that people and places that are mentioned literally in the Old Testament might be symbolically fulfilled. That's the point. Okay? So let's start with that. Now you may say, Joshua, if there's symbolic prophecies and there's literal prophecies, how do you know the difference? The difference is, the way God clarifies this is by giving some prophecies that are so definite that there is no way around them. There is no, misunderstanding. And so he'll give some that are just blatantly clear. And you've got to understand those ones, and they help you understand the symbolic ones. An example of this would be in Daniel 9:25, when it predicts the first coming of Christ. And it predicts that Jesus would be, the first coming, Jesus would be killed. Because many Old Testament prophecies about Jesus mix the old and the new, the first and the second coming together. Remember the mixing of events? Many of the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament mix both the first and second coming into one passage, and they don't separate the two by, about 2,000 years. So how would you know that he would come first, be killed, and then come later on again? The way you know is these definite prophecies, like the one in Daniel 9:25, that gives you the exact year that Jesus was to show up, And then it talks about how Messiah will be cut off, or, the word there is the word used to describe when you cut an animal in half. Messiah obviously is going to be killed, but not for himself. So those definite prophecies give give you an outline to understand whether or not something is symbolic or not. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Oh, and just an example of Old Testament prophecies that mix the first and the second comings together. Look at Isaiah 61, which Jesus quotes in Luke chapter 4, but he leaves out the part about the day of vengeance of our God. Jesus leaves that part out because that doesn't happen till the second coming. Okay. I told you we'd discuss this. Forced parables. This is when the Bible does something. The Bible gives you a teaching that you are forced to conclude this has to be a symbol. All right, let me give you an example. A symbol obviously is like a parable. So that's why I call it forced parables. It's a term I made up. You can use something else if you want. Okay, here's an example. John chapter 6, verse 53. Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, except you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Now, do Christians teach cannibalism? No, they do not. What was Jesus saying then? You got two choices. Either Jesus is recommending cannibalism, which is against, obviously, Old Testament laws. That's an abomination. I mean, that's just ridiculous if you think that's literally true. Huge problems have come in theology for people just thinking Jesus is speaking literally here. That's ridiculous. He explains later on that he's not talking about literally eating his flesh. Verse 63, he said, Is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profits nothing. The words I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. The idea is that Jesus is the word, and so you need to eat the word. Like it says in the Old Testament, his words were found and I did eat them. Or man shall not live on bread alone, by every word that proceeds of the mouth of God. So when you eat Jesus, who is the word of God, that just means eat the Bible. And that means take it in and make it a part of you, just like you eat your food and it becomes part of your body. Your body turns your food into flesh, right? So you are to eat the words of the Bible, take them in, and let them become who you are. Let them transform your life. Jesus is to live in you, and you are to live out his life. That's what it means to eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Son of God. He is the Word of God. That's all it means. It's not symbolic. I mean, it's not literal. It's symbolic. You are forced to the conclusion that this must be symbolic. But the Bible doesn't always tell you, hey, this is a symbol. Just like when it mentioned Elijah and Rachel. It didn't tell you. You are forced to come to that conclusion by the fact that Rachel was dead for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the fact that Elijah had been taken into heaven and some new guy was born. You are forced to come to the conclusion that this must be a symbol. Let me give you another example of a forced parable. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 19 and 20 refer to Babylon. And there's more prophecies on this. But basically all the Old Testament prophecies that refer to the nation of Babylon that existed in the Old Testament being destroyed. It's gone. It's in ruins. You can go and look at the ruins of Babylon today. No one lives there. They tried to rebuild a little bit of the wall, but nobody lives there. And the Old Testament predicted that this great nation would become uninhabited. No one would ever rebuild it as a full city, and no one would live there again. Now, if that's true, and that has happened, Babylon has been empty for centuries, then when in the New Testament, or even in Old Testament prophecies, when it refers to at the end of time, Babylon attacking Israel, guess what? Babylon's not literal. It's a symbol for something else. It's that great harlot in Revelation chapter 17 that is called Mystery Babylon the Great, which we've referred to in other Bible studies. If you haven't looked at those, please look on our Bible studies on the Antichrist, and we explain that very clearly. This is symbolic. In fact, it's speaking of, in Revelation 17, it speaks of a woman who sits on a beast which has 7 heads and 10 horns, and it tells you in that chapter the 7 heads are 7 mountains, and the woman's the great city. So you're looking for a city that sits on 7 hills. That is the great city that's reigning during the time when John wrote the book of Revelation. That would be Rome. It's not literal Babylon. No. And I did a whole study on that. We're not going to go into that right now. But here's the point. You have 2 choices. When Revelation refers to Babylon, if that's literal, then Isaiah was lying by saying Babylon will never be rebuilt and inhabited. You can't have both. You can't have Babylon being restored at the end of time, becoming a great nation and attacking Israel, if Isaiah, in chapter 13 of Isaiah, it says it will never be rebuilt. It'll never become inhabited again. You see that this is a forced parable. You're forced to come to the conclusion that when Babylon is referred to in the New Testament prophecies, it must be symbolic because Babylon doesn't exist anymore. The same thing is true of Israel. The enemies of God's people in the last days are spoken of in terms of a literal nation, but it's symbolic. In the same way the church is referred to in prophecy as the literal nation of Israel, but it's a symbol. If you are Christ, you are Abraham's seed. It's speaking of the church. You see how this works? It's a forced parable. Okay, now that we've referred to all this, let me explain a quick explanation, just a quick one, of the problem that we looked at Matthew 24 at the beginning. And we're about ready to wrap it up. Matthew 24, we saw that it looked like there was a contradiction. It spoke of the second coming, and then it said all these things will be fulfilled. Okay? How is this not a contradiction? The way it works is Jesus was using an Old Testament method that prophets very often used, which we looked at, one of our keys, and that is mixing of events. Jesus mixed 2 events together into one prophecy because the one event is similar to the other event. Not because they happen at the same time, but because they are similar. The 2 events are the destruction of the temple, Herod's temple, which happened in 70 AD, and the destruction of Israel, the Jewish nation at that time, and the second coming. He mixed those 2 events, not because they happened at the same time, but because they are similar. The one is a symbol of the other. The one is a small version of what will happen on a worldwide scale at the end of time. Does that make sense? Now, how do we know that's true? The way we know that's true is when you read Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3, the disciples mixed the 2 events together because they did not understand prophecy. And Jesus, instead of correcting them, he went and used the one event as a symbol for the other and mixed the 2 together. Matthew 24, starting in verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. Okay, so that's the literal temple. They saw it. Hey, here's the building. They're looking at it, right? And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Okay, now Jesus just predicted the temple they're looking at, the literal temple of Herod in those days. He says, see it? I'm telling you, not one stone is going to be left on another. He just predicted the destruction of that temple. We know this happened in 70 AD. Okay? Now the disciples, when they hear this, they think, gosh, that the destruction of the temple, that must be the end of the world. So they asked the question, verse 3, And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? What things? The destruction of the temple, right? And then they say this, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? You see how they mix the destruction of the temple with the second coming? Those are 2 separate events. The destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD. The second coming hasn't happened yet. It's been 2,000 years later. 2 different events, far apart in history, but they're similar. Because at the end of time, the temple, which is the church, is going to be attacked by the enemies of God's people, and God's people will be delivered. Now remember, at the first destruction of the temple, it was the nation of Rome that came upon Israel, surrounded them, attacked them, but Jesus warned them, when you see the army surrounding, flee to the mountains. All the Christians fled, and they were saved. And then that nation was destroyed. Okay? In the same way, at the end of time, the enemies of God's people, very similar to Rome, the way Rome attacked it, the Roman Empire, now referred to as Babylon in Revelation, will come and attack us with the mark of the beast issue, surround us, and they will try to destroy us, but we will escape, and the second coming will happen. Two similar events, but they're apart by 2,000 years. Instead of Jesus saying, hey, no, these are two separate events, he went and mixed the two together. So he refers to, in Matthew 24, he refers to the destruction of the temple. And when he says all these things will happen before this generation passes, a Bible generation is 40 years. The prophecy was given in 31 AD. Before the end of 40 years, 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And so all these things were fulfilled, but not the second coming, because that is something that was just, it was referred to in the same passage, but it's the destruction of the temple was a symbol, and all that trouble was a symbol of all the trouble at the end of time, if that makes sense. So two events were mixed together. That's the point. The destruction of the temple and the second coming were mixed together. That is the point. Hopefully that makes sense. And please use these keys to prophecy to understand Old Testament prophecies. And please, when you get a chance, watch our other video on Israel, or who is the real Israel. We go through clearly that the church in prophecy today is Israel. It's not literal Israel anymore, nor just like it's not literal Babylon anymore. Thank you, and God bless.